Peter, over to you.
Oh, right. Actually, they won't take your statement to the police station. There's nobody there. That's one of the major features of our modern society. Most of the things which used to be there aren't there. And for instance, when I lived in this city in the 1960s, it still had a major engagement of political parties. Let's say hundreds, possibly thousands of people actually belonged as members. You could go to local ward meetings of the Labour Party, and I did. The Oxford City parliamentary seat switched from one party to the other, from election to election. The place was politically alive. You had figures on the city council.
Let me just interrupt you a second.
Yep.
If you've not paid, put a tenner into the collection, please. Find a seat. Or everybody just come in. Carry on, Peter.
Thank you. There were figures on the city council, Janet Young for the Conservatives and Olive Gibbs for Labour, who would become or were already genuine national figures in politics in their own right because of their strong positions. It was a place where there was real adversarial politics of the kind which keep a country free. And this existed, and I experienced it, and I think we will all acknowledge now, this really has ceased to exist. The last Tory, as far as I know, last Tory councillor in the city was hunted down and eaten somewhere on the Barton estate about 15 years ago, and there's been no sign of them since. There is no real party political engagement in this city to match the supposed party division of the country. There is actually no division in the country which matches the party political division in Parliament.
Sorry to interrupt again, Peter. Take a chair from the church, please. Just sit down. There's nothing sacred about that.
And now a word from our sponsor. So,
and more. People who've just come in a tenner, please.
I'm so sorry. Were you asking me? Well, blame him. It's his fault, but I can do nothing about it now. Or unless you want to start again, which I shouldn't think anybody does.
Here we go.
I'm going to pause. I mean, Danny and I could sing the Internationale together for a bit, if you like.
We can all hum it.
I can sing it in two languages.
Yeah. Peter, you were a trot, you didn't know English.
Oh, absolutely, we did. It was just as much ours as theirs.
Right, everybody sat down?
No, they haven't.
All right.
No, and I'm not. I'm going to wait until they have, because I'm not going to have you interrupting me again while I'm trying to think.
Sorry. And all paid as well, that's the important thing. Right.
Okay, do you want to go around with your bus conductors?
And can you all hear Peter at the back?
Can you all hear me at the back?
Yeah.
Because it's too late afterwards to tell me. So we had in this country an adversarial political system, two real political parties to which tens, hundreds of thousands of people actually belonged. They'd go out and work for them at election time. The country was divided. Nothing wrong with the country being divided. In fact, it's probably the most important part of the politics that we have. It's not the things which protect us are not elections. The things which protect us are the rule of law and jury trial and an adversarial parliament. And if you don't have those things, then all the written rules of constitutions and democracy won't save you from anything. And in the 1960s, some of you may remember Richard Neville, the editor of that extremely scurrilous and rude magazine, Oz, saying an extremely intelligent thing, which I repeat at every available opportunity because it was so correct. He said there is an inch of difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, but it is in that inch that we all live. And since he said it, it's my view that that inch is closed, because the two political parties have become in many ways identical, and they do not reflect the division in the country. They no longer represent the old division in the country, because after the destruction of heavy industry and of the old social and industrial mechanism of Britain, particularly under Margaret Thatcher, that ended anyway. But they also don't represent what I believe to be the current division in this country, which is really, you could sum it up as being a division between the Daily Mail and the Guardian. It's not about trade unions, it's not about economic policy, it's about cultural and moral and sexual politics and about global warming. Those are where the real divisions lie. And Parliament doesn't actually represent those divisions. It doesn't represent those of you who are miles to my left. It doesn't represent Danny, and it doesn't represent me. It actually represents a desiccated and outdated establishment to the people, very unsuccessfully, which is why fewer and fewer people actually vote for political parties at general elections. And the level of voting goes down and down and down, and you can obtain a parliamentary majority as such as we have now with a startlingly small number of votes, while millions of people sit on their hands and millions of people vote for parties they don't like because they can't think of anything better to do. And this is a genuine crisis, and it cannot go on indefinitely without the whole thing falling apart. And unless and until we can regain the congruence between the political parties and an actual feeling in the country, this decay of politics will continue to happen, and our governments will become more and more discredited, less and less popular, less and less able to raise the taxes that they demand, less and less able to spend them in a way that anybody wants them spent, less and less able to govern the country. Now, I have myself as an instant solution to all of this, which I have taken to proposing because I think it's important that people start thinking about it, which is that if we wish to actually continue to succeed as a country, and we could, there is one thing we need to do. We have the most amazing blessings on this country, our position, our geographical position, our climate, our landscape, our culture, our history of behaving reasonably well towards each other, of law and freedom, are tremendous assets. We are not rich as we were, but we are still capable of being certainly prosperous at a very high level. But we continue to persist in the belief that we are a superpower, that we are important, that people care about us, that the first thing that Donald Trump will do when he sits down in the Oval Office is think of Britain and wonder about what he should do about Britain. He's barely heard of Britain, and almost all of his people who work for him likewise. If you live in the United States, you'll find that many people there don't even know that English is called English because it comes from England. They don't know who we are. They don't care who we are. We don't matter. We're not a superpower. We maintain, and this is the symbolic change that I think we really have to make. We maintain in this country a colossal superpower, Cold War nuclear deterrent. The Cold War has been over since 1991. We are not a superpower. And what is more, this deterrent doesn't work. The last two times we tried to launch a Trident missile from one of our submarines, on the first occasion it shot out of the tube and veered off across the United States like a whizzing firework until it was aborted. And the second time, and I've actually seen this done, that when it worked the time I saw it, the second time it was belched out of the submarine tube by this mixture of gas and steam, and then it was supposed to ignite and shoot off towards Ascension Island, which is where the range ends. And instead of igniting, it didn't ignite, and instead of shooting off towards Ascension Island, it went like that and fell plop into the sea off Cocoa Beach in Florida. That's our deterrent. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if the whole lot is like that, and I wouldn't also be particularly surprised, given the state of the submarines, if there are some weeks when it isn't actually at sea at all, but they won't say that. Why don't we admit that we can't do this anymore? I don't mind us keeping a few bombs in case of some unforeseeable crisis. And we spend so much money on it, we might as well. But the fantasy that we're a superpower, the fantasy that our seat on the United Nations Security Council is anything other than acting as a nodding dog to the United States, the fantasy that we are important prevents us from seeking a status as a country which is capable of prosperity, good education, sensible foreign policy, policing itself, actually having police in the police station, actually having police on the streets, actually having the ability to defend itself against real enemies instead of participating in wars in which it has no business. That would seem to me to be a huge psychological moment, which if we went through it would enable us to once again become the free country which we used to be. But if we don't do that, if we continue this pretense, then I think we probably will just end up heading faster and faster and faster towards not merely economic and social and educational decay, but towards political decay of an alarming kind. So I hope that helps you formulate a reply.
Yeah.
But I think the problem for Danny is that I agree with him more than he wants me to.
Over to Danny.
Thank you very much. The reason for having a debate about has politics failed, of course, was the timing with the inauguration. And there'll probably be quite a lot of you who are feeling fairly dismal at the moment. Maybe quite a lot of you stopped using Twitter yesterday. Some nodding. Anybody listen to the Today programme this morning? Did you? Okay, if you did, Trump's embassy was on. I've forgotten his official title, but he was speaking for Trump and being interviewed. And the highlight was when he demanded that we must increase our military spending to 5%. I think it was Justin. Justin asked him, what's in it for us? And it was, we'll keep the special relationship. Nothing back, but we must spend more on military. So Peter and I are in great danger of agreeing at the very beginning about nuclear weapons, but that is not what we are debating. What we are debating is whether politics has failed. Now, one problem we have with these kind of debates is it is not very difficult to talk about the past and say how good it was. Not least because in Britain, we were the most equal we'd ever been by income in the 1960s. So no wonder it was a wonderful time. By the 1970s, we were the second most equal large country in Europe to Sweden. We were Scandinavian. And when you have great equality, wonderful things happen. But that isn't because our politics used to be great and isn't anymore. The orange man in Washington isn't any more bigoted than most of our politicians of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We tend to remember their wisest or nicest words. We don't tend to record their everyday conversations, the kind of things they would say about women, about our overseas subjects in our colonies that we still held then. So we create a story about how great it was. By chance, I was reading a transcript, this is how sad I am, a transcript of the debate following the Beveridge report being leaked. I was really pleased to see Quentin Hogg. Quentin Hogg was the Member of Parliament for Oxford, and there's a famous by-election where the slogan from Labour was, a vote for Hogg is a vote for Hitler. Quentin Hogg in 1942 weighed in on the debate and said, this is a great report, it can only be funded by a transfer of wealth, and it's economically sensible, it'll happen. So I could cherry pick you things from the past, quite incredible things that are really uplifting, and create you a story about wonderful politics in the past. But I could equally pick you things that were said or done in the 60s. It was certainly vibrant. I was there. I wasn't very part of the debate, let's just put it like that. But I could also tell you what Labour did with their Immigration Act in 1965 and what was behind that. And this is the political party I'm a member of. I could talk to you about the nastiness of politics in the past. And I can also tell you what's good now and how much has been achieved by the politics that we've had between the 1960s and now. Yes, there were thousands of people in the city who were members of political parties. My mum ran Labour committee rooms in Risinghurst. It was busy. This is a tiny suburb on the edge of Oxford, right? I knocked up in February 1974, and I knocked on doors in October, I think it was, 1974. We had 2 general elections. That's what we did. But we only had, was it 2, maybe 3 TV channels? Right, there wasn't much else to do. I'm very grateful you've all come because, you know, there are many, many other options you've had. One reason that engagement in politics fell is that there were other activities to do. Sadly, at the moment, both our main political parties do not particularly want there to be too many members. It's not in their interests. They raise their money from rich people, not from subscriptions, and members are really annoying. They might have their views of their own, which might not coincide with the great leaders. And that is a problem. But that happens from time to time. But the idea that politics is broken, that there was a real special age and we've lost it, just doesn't work. I think it was Eisenhower who talked about the dangers of the industrial military complex, the influence of really rich men trying to get what they want. Nowadays, you can see it. In a way, it's got better. We know what's happening in America. We have a fairly good idea what happens here. We know about Tufton Street and the Conservatives, and when it doesn't work and when it does work. We know quite a bit about who's funded Nigel Farage over the years and his offices in Mayfair. We know about the donors to the Labour Party. The corruption in politics at least is partly open and evident in a way it was not in the past. So saying that the past was much better, a lot of it was more secretive. We were still governed by people who had been to various of these colleges. Howard Wilson was Jesus. You know, he may be the most dynamic Labour leader we've actually had since the Second World War. He's still a Jesus College boy. Right? Everybody had to come to a college in Oxford, bar Gordon Brown and John Major. We didn't have a golden age of minors as ministers. We had a few, but not many. Our politics in the past in this country was still an extension of the Oxford Union in Westminster. It still is in a way, but it is slowly changing. So yes, the Prime Minister wasn't an undergraduate here, right? Major achievement in making politics better. And he could only have gone to Leeds University because the state paid his fees or whatever. Okay, Mum and Dad paid for the Masters at Teddy Hall, but he doesn't talk about that. And he's still an Oxford man, in case you're worrying. And Rachel Reeves went to St John's. It's the same old, same old. It hasn't broken. It's not suddenly much worse. It could be much better. It isn't all men, which it was. We've had our first Prime Minister who was not white. Things change. Some things get better. Not everything gets worse. We in the UK are at our most unequal economically since 1936. We have poverty in this city that we haven't seen for decades. It's well hidden, but it's there because of the cost of living crisis and the high rents and other things that happen. But that's not about broken politics. That is because we had a go or tried or wanted to be great again. And we thought that the way to be great again was to reward talent and let the tall poppies grow tall. And it turns out that doesn't win you very much as a society. But our politics is still all here. In fact, we've got more of it. So we have devolution. We have a parliament in Edinburgh. That parliament, and I don't think it would have mattered whether it was the SNP or Labour, that parliament has been involved in things which have resulted in Scotland having the lowest child poverty rate in the UK. That's politicians knowing the part of the UK they're in and caring about it more than Westminster did. Right? Politicians are not less useful than they were in the past. You could try and construct a measure of what they have done. They're not brilliantly better here. Worldwide, just to wrap it up, the correlation with the extension of democracy worldwide and living standards getting better is pretty clear. And we could, maybe we'll leave it later to talk about communism and that. But that's a particular kind of politics. And it's worked for China, right? You know, so the idea that our politics doesn't work. Incidentally, the current attitudes in China are they're in a desperately terrible situation because they've only got economic growth of 5, 6 or 7%. And they've never known it that low in the lives of most Chinese people. And it's intolerable. You know, can you imagine that being our biggest problem? Economic growth of 5, 6 or 7%. I don't happen to think economic growth is the answer. But my basic argument, before we agree about nuclear weapons, is that it isn't any worse than it's ever been. The last election was a remarkably low turnout, so not usually enthusiastic in this country. Labour won a landslide with fewer votes than my friend Jeremy Corbyn secured in 2019. We have a bizarre electoral system whose days are numbered. The answer is, or the question is, at what point are we going to go for something a little bit more democratic? We could end up with Trump politics here. We are clearly the first in the sights. It's not Greenland they want. It's not Panama. It's not Canada. What Trump's people want is the UK. That's the price. They're willing to pay for it. Decided that Nigel might not get it, so want him removed and somebody else. They didn't neatly arrange that. I very much suspect that Kemi, and probably Nigel, because he's a survivor, will announce 4 months before the next election that they've come to an understanding, and the business-friendly, thrusting young Conservatives will be standing in the cities, and Reform will be standing on the coast and in the countryside. And I wouldn't be surprised if between them they don't get a landslide. But at least we can be aware of that and what can go wrong. We haven't had a coup. We haven't suspended an election, as we had to do between 1935 and 1945. We haven't had the situation they've just had in Korea. That's a broken politics, which, because of the engagement of people in Korea, including some of the bravest students in this university, some of the other students didn't want them to say anything because they're connected to the ruling party, right? So and that's political action. Watching students produce protests about a coup in the country and a potential broken politics, and they've almost reversed it. We're nowhere near that. We don't have a dictator like Putin in forever and ever. We're not in the situation that they are in Hungary. We're in the same old, same old. Not what I would like to happen. I would like something different. I would like us to slowly get towards it. But I'm not suggesting we need some kind of revolution because we've got some terrible problem. Democracy is incredibly new as a system. It is very, very recent. Human beings take 3 or 4 generations to get used to new things. We don't instantly work out how to deal with something that's new. We think we can learn straight away. It takes longer to do that. You have to change how democracy works. You begin towards involving more people. You have the kind of situation they had in Ireland, where to make it possible to marry, if you were gay, they had to have a whole load of discussions, but it worked. That's the real, from my point of view, work in politics. So I'm not defending the system we have, but I'm trying to argue it is no more broken than what we had in the last decade, in the 1990s, in the 80s, in the 70s, in the 50s, and in the 40s, let alone the chaos of the 1920s and 1930s. So I suggest that I could claim, my knowledge is far from encyclopedic, but if any of you were to name a particular decade and say that was so much better, I could tell you what I think was worse about it. I think I'm going to win this one because I'm competitive. Our politics is bad. It's not broken. It could be. Those rich Americans could buy us. And that's our current clear and present danger. But at least they're on the Today programme, honestly telling us what the deal is, rather than doing it in complete secret with Rachel and Keir. Thank you very much.
Peter, any riposte?
Well, it's nice to be out-conservative by Danny. I think you're remarkably complacent to say that our political system is as good as you seem to think that it is, or as workable or as serviceable as you seem to think that it is. And I think you're mistaken. I never said that there was that the past was especially good. It was different, And it had advantages over what we now have, because, as I say, I do believe that if you want to have literacy in the country, then you must have limited government. And if you want to have limited government, you have to have an effective parliament. And if you want to have an effective parliament, it has to be adversarial, it has to be capable. And this is the great virtue of the electoral system which we have, which you weirdly dislike. It has to be capable of turning out governments which people do not like. The fact that we can put, I remember it well, Edward Heath in Downing Street with his grand piano in a night, putting all his possessions into a removal van and having to leave against his will. That's not something that you can do in any continental country. If you want to get rid of the government of any continental country, you can vote as much as you like. Nothing will change, almost certainly after they've counted the votes and then they've had the intense 6 months negotiations before the coalitions are formed. You end up with the same government you had before, with a few different people in the coalition, but otherwise nothing changed. You can't get rid of them. We have this tremendous advantage. We should at least treasure it, rather than constantly say, oh, let's have proportional representation like everyone else. It's not a good idea. So I'd make those 2 points. I'm more radical than you are. I think that the point about our constitution is that because it depends so much on the 2 parties, that those 2 parties are the part of it which needs to be changed. Now, the 2 parties we have are the wrong parties. We need new ones. And if the broadcasting rules, which protect the status quo, and the immense amount of covert funding of political parties by the state, and the ludicrous amounts of private money which people are allowed to give to political parties, you shouldn't be able to give them contributions as large as you can. If that were controlled, then it wouldn't take very long for new parties to form. That's what I recommend. And I think that would bring us a lot closer to being a functioning democracy than we are now.
Danny, any ripostas?
Okay, so I'm a quantitative social scientist. So if you want to argue that PR is a bad idea, I'd suggest you have to look at things like the standards of living of people in countries with PR and how it's changed over time compared to ours. How long people live, how likely their children are to be ill, the heights of children in countries that have had PR, and how taller they grow compared to us. I would just measure it if you want a way of saying which system is better. The politics that ends up with people living better lives, having better quality housing. The whole of the EU now has 3% higher incomes than we do, including all of Eastern Europe. The poorest fifth are better off than our poorest fifth. We're peripheral. And you can't prove it, but not having a democratic system, first past the post, is hardly democratic, doesn't tend to result in good long-term outcomes. The US is worse with its Senate, but has worse long-term outcomes for its population. You can play with the different PR systems in different countries. It may not feel that things have changed, say in Finland, where the Conservatives are in rather than the Social Democrats and another 4 parties. But it feels certainly that they've changed to the Finns. They'll say this is huge. You may not see it as like here. Similarly, when Labour get in, as they did in 1997, and on a promise to keep to Conservative spending plans for 2 years, you're hardly getting something new. Quite similar to Starmer getting in and saying, we'll best be more competent, but we're not going to make a really big change. It's not much of a choice. I agree our parties are the wrong parties at the moment. They are strange and bizarre parties. But we've had one of the fastest increases in new parties at last election. I forget how many Green MPs we've got now. For years, we only had 1. Okay, well, now we've got a few. Sunak probably called the election early because he could see how many MPs Reform were going to get. This is relatively new in English politics, outside of the other countries of the UK, to suddenly be dealing with so many more. But we're trying to do a multi-party system under a voting system designed to only work if you've got 2 parties, which creates a chaotic set of possibilities. You get the right number of votes in the right places, and you can sweep the board with a very low proportion. And you don't want your votes too concentrated, which was one of Labour's problems in the past. You don't want mining seats where everybody's the next miner, wasted votes. And you don't want your votes too spread out like the Liberals, otherwise you don't get much, or the Greens. But it's a bizarre system that only had a sense of credibility when there were just two main parties. And we switched very quickly from the Liberals and the Conservatives to Labour and the Conservative. And so it appeared to be plausible to do this. Adversarial, last one. The idea that you make the most progress by having people shouting at each other with a gap that's a sword width or whatever in length due to some... the rest of the world has redesigned its parliaments, they're circular and so on. It's not that the rest of the world is wrong and we're right. The rest of the world has tried various innovations, and you can look at the outcomes for their people in terms of simply how well they're doing in very, very basic measures, such as how often their babies die as compared to our babies dying, but also their ability in education. And I'd say they're doing better. But that doesn't mean our politics is broken. It's just not very good compared to other affluent nations.
A bit far-fetched, Danny. You just think, vote for PI, your kids will be taller than you.
Well, you've got to try and work out why have children got shorter in England. By the way, they got taller in Scotland, and they have a different voting system. Now, obviously, it's not a direct one thing causes the other, but one way in which you know your country is really, really badly managed is when the children start to become stunted. And that has happened in England in the last 10, 15 years.
Well, I don't know about that. I grew up in the great era of equality and post-rationing, and I'm a short ass. So I don't necessarily think that your theory works. It may be what they call a meaningless correlation. I think I should be careful with it.
Why should we bother to vote?
That's really hard. Because we're in the right place for that. I mean, it's a bit like praying. It's if you think about what it is you do when you vote, the main reason you vote is because you've voted before. So if you can get people to vote once, they tend to go and vote again. The chance of your individual vote altering anything is minuscule. Not quite zero, because I think it happened once somewhere. Right? So it's an act of faith. You'll do the Winston Churchill quote better than me over systems. I think it is like praying. I think it is about being part of a culture and about beliefs. Personally, I'm in favour of voting in democracy because I hope people would do other things in the rest of their lives, like discuss with their friends and neighbours what they think about things, along with going along one day and putting a cross in a box. But it is, once you think about the statistics of voting, it is quite incredible that people go and do this. But people do a whole set of cultural things, which, and they will fight for the right to do it. And women died under horses in the Derby, for this right to have a chance to do something where individually, almost certainly, your own action doesn't have one iota difference on the world.
Peter, why bother to vote?
Well, I haven't voted for years, so I'm the last person to ask. Often the most effective thing you can do in our current system, and I wish more people would do it, is to abstain from voting. There are certain people in this room who will remember me in 2010 begging them not to vote Conservative that year, because the last thing that a proper Conservative would want to do would be to endorse David Cameron's Blairite putsch and take over the Conservative Party on behalf of Tony Blair. But I could not get anybody to accept this. But we have an enormous power as voters through mass abstention if we only chose to use it, because the only way in which politicians are legitimized is by the votes which are cast for them. And just imagine if they held a general election and nobody came. They would not have any legitimacy. So I'm not the person to ask why to vote. I'm the person to ask why not to vote, which is what I frequently say to people they should do, not vote, or rather what they should not do.
That's a nice anti-Trotskyite slogan. Why have a general election? Nobody came. What about Starmer, the anti-politician?
Well, he's not very good at being a politician. Basically, he is a lawyer, and what he does is he prosecutes the country rather than governs it. I'm not even sure that he was ever a member of the Labour Party until about a year before he became a Labour MP. I don't think he's fundamentally a Labour person. I've tried to find out, by the way, from official sources, whether he was a member of the Labour Party and which constituency he was in, and I can't get an answer. So I find that fascinating.
He was a Trotskyite. He was a Pavlovite.
Oh, he was fascinating. Yes, he was a Pavlovite. Would anybody like a disquisition on Pavlovism? Oh, go on. You'll enjoy it. Pablo was the nom de guerre of a Greek revolutionary called Michalis Raptis, who a few years ago was given a state funeral by Andres Papandreou in Athens, his old friend. Raptis, or Pablo, was a real old-fashioned, rough, tough revolutionary. He spent time in jail for running guns to the Algerian rebels against France in the 50s. And he then got a bit tired of old-fashioned revolutionary politics and saw it as a dead end, and devised what he called a red-green position, which was basically a mixture of quite radical sexual and moral and cultural politics along the lines of the Equality Act in this country, and combined that with a very strong commitment to green policy. And that was his invention. And the magazine which propounded this theory was edited by one Keir Starmer for some years in the 1980s. And Starmer was, and he doesn't, to his great credit, when he's asked about it by the New Statesman, he doesn't deny it or try to belittle it. And he also says he still more or less believes in it. So you actually have a declared Marxist revolutionary as leader of the Labour Party and First Lord of the Treasury, which is quite fun if you find politics amusing at all. But it's nothing to do with what we're arguing about.
Is he a socialist, Danny?
I think Tony Blair called himself a socialist. My favourite.
Well, he was another university Trotskyist, but he kept much quieter about it.
My favourite definition is it just means to be social, care about other people. You can all be socialists if you want. Then we can argue about it. But things change. I mean, if you're being nihilistic about this, I was born in this city, left at 18. I came back about 12 years ago. Many shocks. Many things had actually changed incredibly in a city which doesn't think it changes. One shock was coming to these streets and seeing all these posters up for a by-election for a ward, and they were all green or red. And the idea that North Oxford would be a red-green by-election area, and that this was true blue, and these were multi-billion-pound houses with Labour or Green posters in. Right? That's a change. And it's a change of mind and attitudes amongst many people over time. No single one individual is that important, but something had altered.
You're an anywhere. You could be anywhere in the country. You know, anywhere and somewhere.
I'm on this. Was it David? What's his name? The Cosmopolitan.
Kent, yes.
Oxford runs through me like the name on a stick of rock.
But basically, he says that people like Danny are anywhere. They can be anywhere in the country, and it doesn't matter anywhere in the world.
Anywhere in the world.
And somewhere, the people who've born and bred and lived there, and that's what they do. Are you in anywhere or somewhere?
I'm a rootless cosmopolitan, I think. I have lived anywhere, and it doesn't particularly bother me. I do feel a very strong affinity with this country, but actually I wasn't born here either. So probably I'm anywhere on the good heart. On the good heart scale, I'm probably in anywhere rather than somewhere, though I'd quite like to be somewhere.
So the relevance.
I'm very fond of Portsmouth.
Yeah, very much.
You brought up.
In a way, David Goodhart was saying that politics has failed because we're now governed by a set of people who have no affinity to a place and just think they're superior. And that's always a problem. But it's trying to complain about the present, again, as if there was a golden age. You can't claim that politics is broken unless you can show it was working really well before.
Why does it have to work really well? I mean, politics surely is something that probably never will work really well, except in a country where it's controlled by one man, and it works really well because he makes it do so. But that doesn't mean anybody likes it or it's good for people.
Politics
in a living society in which people disagree honestly with each other is never going to work well. It's always going to be difficult and troublesome. And when you, in my view, belittle the adversarial principles, people shouting at each other across the chamber, that's not what it is.
Yeah.
It's people who genuinely disagree with each other, who compete for government, and one side always ready to take over the government when the other fails, but also having to listen to each other. The late Queen Mother had quite a good constitutional theory when she was asked what her ideal government would be. Many of you will not agree with her, but I think you'll get what she was driving at. She said the ideal government for this country was a good old Tory government with a very strong Labour opposition. And strong opposition can make a huge difference if it is strong. And also it makes a huge difference if that opposition can, at any time, be expected to take over and become the government. And I do really think this is immensely important. Lots of countries simply don't have this.
No.
And it was, interestingly enough, when Ukraine was working well before the 2014 putsch, one of the best things about Ukraine was it had a genuinely functioning democracy. Power changed hands. Presidents of very different parties, East and West, took office. The Rada, the parliament, was divided pretty much equally between the two. And as a result, Ukraine was much freer, for instance, than its neighbor Russia. But that was why it was. Not because Ukraine is some kind of sainted country, but because they had a proper adversarial system, in many ways by accident, but it worked quite well. Serhii Plokhy, in his recent book, writes about this, and it's very interesting that people that don't actually realize how important that was in the history of Ukraine.
You wanted to come back.
I always want to come back. Queen Mother, Elizabeth's mother.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
There was only one Queen Mother, surely.
Only one ever, yeah. No, when not impolite. Always, what politics would we get if we actually had taken the views of the royal family at various points? I'm thinking of a particular photo, a photo where the controversy was that as a child, Queen Elizabeth was doing a salute. Do you remember that one? I didn't make this up.
You really are taking
I am. We don't mention this, but the interesting thing about the photo is nobody commented about the adult who was doing it, who was the Queen Mother. She wasn't a child. Anyway, let's not go into the politics of the royal family.
It was the man she really hated, Edward VIII, who was the saluter.
Yes. You should be doing that.
The Elon Musk salute.
But one thing our politics has done is reduce the control of an aristocrat and other people whose views are not necessarily nice over how people think. One thing I learned by going to other countries and making a huge mistake of addressing an audience like this and saying how well you've done on a particular measure. You have the best measure of this in the world. How did you do it? Is that the reaction, which I should have realised earlier, is always, we're awful, our politics is no good, our politicians have failed. And when you go, but you've got the best record on health the planet's ever seen, it's not good enough. So wherever you go in the world, people think their politics is bad, not working, sometimes not as good as it used to be, even when they are achieving more than has been achieved anywhere else. Right? You always get people moaning. That isn't necessarily a problem, because if you sat back, if you're complacent, things wouldn't get better. But there's nowhere where people are self-satisfied with what they have achieved or their set of representatives have achieved. So it's rather hard to measure.
Yeah, but sometimes they have good reason to be cheesed off. In other places, it's just general moaning. But some of it, they really are bad.
I'm waiting for all those people who were ecstatic in the US who you saw in your news, that cannot believe just the victory that's just occurred for them. I'm wondering, at what point, when the sunlit uplands don't appear within 3 months, well, they'll presumably blame somebody for it. They're not going to ever say, oh, maybe this one man and his friends cannot suddenly make America great again. So I do worry a bit about how they're going to react when they don't get hardly any of what they actually want or have been promised.
Danny, you're just off a plane from China.
Yeah.
Did you find an opposition there? Find PR there?
It was 8 days, so it's only my second trip to China. It's interesting. The trains work. There's a public toilet every 50 meters in some cities with a quality, free, like a 4-star hotel in Mayfair quality toilet, right? So if the party wants to do certain things, toilets and trains was my highlights. I'm a man of a certain age. And you really have middle class man of a certain age who functioning public toilets is very high on my priority. No, you can't observe that much, and obviously I was being observed. One interesting thing was I was told by my friends who were taking me around, I was asking, what are all the old people doing? For a start, I wanted to know where they all were, because this is an ageing country. And they were largely hanging around outside their houses, chatting. And the women were hanging around chatting, and the men were hanging around chatting separately. And I wanted to know what they were chatting about. And for the men, I was told it's politics. And I went, but they're not allowed to do that, are they? You know, you can't really talk politics in China. Apparently, that's the main gossip of old men. My hosts, one of them suggested to me that you can complain. The complaints of the old are taken more seriously, not the young. Better in writing, you get a reply. The fear of the party is that there is a way to get rid of them. And the way to get rid of the party in China, which has happened twice in the last 100 years, is civil war or revolution. Now, I'm not advocating this at all, but this was an explanation I was given about why they bothered about the public toilets. I don't think you're going to get a revolution about public toilets, but it was, if things get really bad in China, then they will not just lose their jobs, they'll lose all their wealth, everything else, small chance of being shot. That concentrates the mind. Whereas one problem with, not necessarily problem with democracy is, if you lose, you keep the pension for life as a former Prime Minister. Nobody takes away the housing allowances unless you lose your seat as an MP. The consequences of losing are relatively low, apart from ego, in the UK. I'm not suggesting that a communist dictatorial system is great. It was just interesting to hear a view I'd never heard before about why bother about the living standards of people if you could treat them really badly and they've got no choice.
Time for some short, sharp questions. Do stand up, please, and remember, no statements to police stations down the road. Gary, Professor Gary Brown, Professor of Political Thought.
Yeah, and why not? And I'm reminded, we're not far from where Dorling operated, the Dorling historian. He said, it's absolutely absurd that people compare Hobbes and Plato. They're not talking about the same thing. Politics changes, and any decent historian will know that things change. So the offset of this debate, or this talk, is the open statement by that we are living in very different circumstances from what obtained after the development of industrial society and a cohesive classes against one another with an adversarial system, and we had an empire. These are different circumstances. So this pleading for what went before is to deny difference. What we should be doing is working with what we've got and working towards a new form of politics, which we probably are doing in a fairly kind of gradual way. So let's dump this comparing, cross the centuries, and admit that we've got difference.
Response?
Yeah, I don't think I said anything about the empire. You imagined that bit, but that's all right. People imagine all kinds of things about me all the time. I'm used to it. But the only points of comparison that we have are with what's already happened and its experience, and it tells us how things could be different from how they are now, and it also tells us how they might change in our own lifetimes in the future. When I'm saying this thing has changed, I think that if you're going to have universal suffrage democracy, then nobody serious can decry a high level of engagement with it by the people. You have to have large numbers of people directly engaged in politics who care about it in political parties trying to influence events. Otherwise, your universal suffrage democracy will die, as it is doing. And I don't think Danny portrayed me as people, again, always do, as harking back to some sort of golden age. It wasn't a golden age. There were many, many things wrong with it. But I don't think they begin to compare with the things that are wrong with the position we're in now. And it's worth, if you want to put it right, then you surely need to examine the ways in which it used to be better and try to work out how they could be better again. I think, as I say, that the freezing of the existing parties by the three things I mentioned, that is to say, the broadcasting rules, which favours the existing arrangements and give enormous advantage to existing parties at every election. I'd get rid of what the broadcasting rules grant to existing parties, enormous amounts of coverage at election time, and more or less exclude coverage of new parties. If you're a new party, you do, because you simply don't qualify. It's not that there isn't any impartiality, so you can't get rid of it. The other point is that there is an enormous amount of state subsidy, particularly to opposition parties, but now in covert ways also to government parties, which keeps them going when they couldn't raise money themselves. And finally, there's the way in which dodgy billionaires have taken over party financing in this country. We should have a very, very strict upper limit on what any person and what any corporation and any trade union could give to a political party. We should make it far harder for them to rely on the big donors to keep them alive when they would otherwise be dead. They're on life support. You can hear the beeping if you listen carefully. They're on life support. They ought to die. And if you pulled out the plug, they would. And I think we should pull out that plug and allow new parties to develop. I don't say let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let 2 flowers bloom would be fine for me, but let them be different flowers from the 2 we have at the moment.
Danny?
I absolutely agree with you over the long term. You can't compare. But short term, we need a measure of failure or an idea what failure is. There is an international failed state index I really like, because every year it produces a ranking for 197 countries in the world, which is least failed. And the term failed state is pretty serious. You can say your state is failing, but failed is serious. And you can see these going up and down with various measures. The situation I described in Korea, they were facing the chance, martial law, the suspension of elections, anything goes, by the party of the rich take power potentially for decades. So you need an idea about what a failed politics actually would be. The colonels take over in Greece. Franco is all-powerful in Spain. And you need a celebration for when you overcome a failed politics, which occurs rarely but does occur. One thing that really annoys me, news reports about the rise of the far right. It's like the sea always comes in. Right? Newspapers never much report about the fall of the far right. And so you're always thinking that the far right are growing and taking over and Europe's becoming fascist. Golden Dawn, if you can remember them in Greece, they were destroyed by the courts and by women judges and are hardly there at all. A lot of hard work involving a murder in one particular case. The New York Times used to produce a graph for Europe showing for each country what proportion of people voted far right. And that was really useful because you could then look at the past and see which ones had come down, right? So there's a danger of thinking that things are always failing, but we need a concept of what a failed politics would be to know when it gets really serious, but when you have to decide, am I actually going to go and hold a candle, on that huge protest or not? And people do that in times and places when it actually matters. And so it's dangerous to call our politics failed because it's crying wolf at a time when it hasn't failed.
What would you both say to Elon Musk and his attempt to influence British politics?
I would say that he wouldn't. He looks like Ricky Gervais off The Office when he was dancing yesterday. If you saw him, he clearly doesn't take any advice at all, because that clip from yesterday, slightly a laughing stock. He's not going to take any notice of what anybody says, but nobody who has any views anywhere like mine is going to be allowed anywhere near him because he is the richest man on the planet. So, you know, you can't influence him other than don't use Twitter, don't buy those dodgy electric cars his company makes, just boycott Musk.
Peter, what would you say to Musk and his attempt to...
I'm against both interfering in other people's countries and other countries interfering in my own, whoever it is, even if it's someone who was overtly friendly to me. It's just straightforwardly wrong. And I suppose when I was a correspondent in Washington, I saw a very large episode of the United States interfering very deeply in the affairs of my country, and was shocked and angered by it, and it's influenced my attitude towards the United States ever since. And I don't think we should allow it. And I think everybody at all points in the political spectrum, whatever their position, should reject it and condemn it. It doesn't matter whether he appears to be on your side or not. Foreign interference in a sovereign country is just straightforwardly wrong. Otherwise, why have sovereign countries in the first place?
Another question? Anybody? Yeah, stand up if you don't mind, so people can hear you.
I mean, would the panel therefore condemn Bill Gates and Larry Fink attending Downing Street immediately before the budget? And do you think any undue influence is exercised in that case? For example, whether BlackRock might benefit from the inheritance tax provisions, would you equally condemn those? And the influence of other billionaires, for example, the Open Society Foundation, and the funding that has been provided by that. I mean, would you condemn all of these forms of influence on our politics?
Yes.
That's the answer, Peter. Danny, rich men influencing politics.
I think you can show almost always it doesn't tend to be beneficial. The real answer is to not have so many rich men in future. You know, a bit of wealth redistribution, and you don't have to worry about what the billionaires do. Soros is interesting over, I would say, probably the most magnanimous over the Central European University. But still, I'd rather not have one person deciding to do things, even if I like quite a lot of what he did. And the equivalent for Britain is Joseph Rowntree. I have twice failed to become a trustee of the Rowntree Foundation. The Rowntree Reform Trust, which is really good fun, because the Rowntree Reform Trust is not a charity. They can do whatever they like with their money. They fund campaign against the arms trade. They fund all kinds of troublemakers. Just 7-10 grand a year here, right? And you can see why it'd be attractive to be sitting there. My problem is, and my family's are Quakers, so that helps, but they're not liberal. And the Rowntree Reform Trust used to give 1.8 million a year to the office of the leader of the Liberal Democrats to keep it alive. But the problem is that it feels like it always has to do that. Now think what you could do with 1.8 million pounds a year, not a charity. You can give it to anybody who wants to do anything causing trouble in any way. And we can't because of the wish of a man who's been dead for over 100 years to support what was the most radical political party in the UK in 1902, but it carries on. So that the wishes of rich men, especially dead rich men, don't make much sense to carry on following.
If Wahid Ali came to you, Peter, and said, here's a lot of money to form a new political party, what would you do?
Turn it down. There isn't anything else you can do. And this is the straightforward principle. You have to not allow yourself to be bored.
Danny?
No, you don't. The minute you start taking money in all kinds of things in life, and this is tempting if you don't, you can be offered, will you come and do a talk here, we'll pay you this much. You start changing your actual behaviour. You start changing what you prioritise, and you sell your soul. But you have to be fortunate enough to be in a position where you don't have to take it because you're paid enough to get through. And and lucky enough to realise that becoming very rich, if you get that chance, isn't going to make you happy. So I'm not condemning people who take money, but it actually damages you, your life, what you do, and it is always there on offer in some way or whatever. You know, we'll fly you here. It'll be a nice hotel, £500 for your time. Could you do a speech to them? Sounds ever so innocent. Once you get onto that track, somebody else says, will you do something? And in your head, you're going, how much are you going to pay me? And before you know, you've become a different person.
Neither's been paid tonight. They get a pizza at the end of the night. Just so you know.
Yeah.
Time for one more question. Come with the curious amongst you. Yes, a gentleman at the back.
I would have thought that one of the main functions of a political party and political system is to provide secure and safe housing for people. So I grew up in a council house. We never had a threat of leaving, being kicked out of our house. It seems now that a lot of people don't have that, and there's the rise of vandalism. There's a lot of insecurity in housing. So is that not a symptom of broken politics? You can't provide decent housing, secure housing.
Yes, it is. And it's one of the great failures and great differences of modern times. I think some of you will have noticed that Rick Stein a few days ago offered a menu in one of his restaurants where the prices were those of, I think, 1970-ish. And the Daily Mail did a very interesting follow-up to that, of comparing the prices of the necessities of life then with the prices of them now. And the astounding thing about it, it's worth looking it up if you can find it on the web. The astounding thing about it was it's not just a matter of inflation. The cost of doing things which people found relatively simple 50 years ago, getting a roof over your head, actually feeding your family, all these things were immensely cheaper than they are now. And one thing which I think is very regrettable is that it was then possible for one breadwinner to provide for an entire family, so that another adult could be at home with the children, which is a major loss, which we've sustained and has done an awful lot of damage to society. And one of the key parts of that is housing. This city is full of what used to be council estates, many of them rather well built and well designed and spacious with more than adequate gardens. And those, of course, have been the ones which have been sold. I'm amazed at the consensus among many people left and right now that the sale of council houses was a good thing. It was a catastrophe. And the replacement of it, housing benefit, is a disaster, and an extremely expensive disaster. And I just don't see why people rejoice over the destruction of settled and successful communities and the destruction of a resource which enabled people to live reasonably comfortably without going bankrupt, with a guaranteed roof over the heads of them and their children. It has enormously changed politics, but it's gone. I agree with you.
Danny? This is the way in which we measure political success and failure, or completely broken. So completely broken would be a situation of children living on the streets. You know, at that point I'd say it's a broken society. And our politics got worse. We had the best social housing building program in the world. We were world leading. The Americans hated it because they thought it was the road to socialism. You know, once you begin to think the state can provide housing, not just education and health, but housing, what's going to happen next? And there's a lovely, lovely book by Nancy Quack on how America interfered around the world with various countries, giving them money to incentivize them to have a private housing only system and not do this, and eventually came to the United Kingdom in 1980 when it was our turn. This is American advice about right to buy, to kill off this dangerous thing which is the road to socialism. However, in this city, in the last 5 years, we have actually built more council houses than in the 25 previous years. That's partly because the 25 previous years were so abysmal. But I think it's around about 1,000. I did a talk in in Italy village, and it was interesting where people were very not obviously wanting the council houses near them or near the badgers, but wanting them because they couldn't get people to do certain jobs that aren't being done in Oxford anymore. So you can see this across the board realisation. You have to hand it to the administration of this city that it managed to turn the tide and begin to rebuild. So you need about a third to a half of your housing needs to be social for your society to work. Our problem in this city, to tread on for anybody can, is it's 160,000 people. It's the biggest city between Birmingham and London, and it's too small. And you can't have two major universities, one wanting to be an elite international university and 4 hospitals in a city that's half of a London borough. You can't do it. You can't do it satisfactorily. And we have just taken almost the last car worker's house by the most recently appointed associate professor, who, with a little bit of a trust fund for mum and dad, is able to buy on Barton, right? And that house that they bought on Barton is not as good as it was in 1970 when I saw it. So this is an interesting political problem. What are we going to do in this city? We've begun to change it, but the measure will be, and the repercussions are far wider. It's actually about the success of the major industries of this city. And it'll stall if people can't actually come and be here. And that's a political problem, and only politics can solve it, right? And only politicians can tell the colleges that own the land that they can't have that land anymore, and they'll be okay. And only by talking with each other can we say, yes, that slope is rather nice, but it's not the end of the world if it has a set of European-style apartments on it with people taking electric tricycles down to car parks rather than playing golf on Hinksey Heights, right? And that's an argument. A little bit adversarial, but work it out. You can't have a relic city not changing forever. It's slightly ridiculous. And that's what good politics is arguing about it rather than not talking about it, because it's a bit uncomfortable, because we quite like Oxford as it's always been.
We've come to an end. As they say in broadcasting, end thought, 30 seconds, Peter.
Well, it's good to know there's something that Danny thinks that I really, really hate. Concreting over the heights of Cumnor and the lands of the scholar gypsy is pretty awful. It's not, I mean, I'm not going to argue about housing now, but it is actually one of the amazing things in which the two major parties are completely and utterly in step. The concreting over of the country with horrible houses in which in many cases nobody actually ends up living because they think it will lead to economic success. It's Philistine and barbarian and wrong. And how anyone can live here and not value its beauty, I don't know.
Danny, 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Yeah, I want to end with where Peter started, because it was heartwarming. Over big political issues like our nuclear weapons. You know, we got the cruise missiles out by politics, around this city, Green and Common, Upper Hayford, and so on. We have this relic, Trident, American-controlled system, which largely doesn't work. But it is not allowed politically to suggest we do something about it. The amount of money that we spend on what we call defence is ridiculous at a time when we can no longer even make steel of the melting old steel down. And it's that kind of thing which needs to be done. I wouldn't describe it as broken, but it is fairly pathetic that this country, which cannot maintain some basic services, has several hundred schools with rooms that children can't go in because the roof will still collapse, has a health service in disarray, is posturing with saying how important it is as a nuclear power with an expensive system that doesn't work and that we don't control. And our politics will be better when those nuclear weapons have gone.